The alien sun cast long shadows over the excavation site as Dr. Hannah Kim carefully scraped away another layer of soil. For 3 weeks, her team had been working on this remote planet, cataloging what appeared to be ruins of an ancient civilization. The exoplanet, designated KX-329, orbited a distant star in what humans called the Lyra sector, far from Earth's bustling colonies. Hannah wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, but the work remained hot and demanding. Around her, the excavation team was packing up equipment for the day, their voices carrying across the dig site. "I'm going to check one more section," she called to her assistant June, who nodded while organizing their findings. Hannah moved to a depression they had identified earlier that morning, a perfectly circular pit that their scans suggested contained dense metal deposits. As senior archaeologist on the expedition, she had insisted on examining this feature personally. Her brush swept away fine particles, revealing something that made her breath catch. A smooth, translucent surface began to emerge, not stone or metal, but something like crystal. She worked faster, heart pounding. "June," she called, "bring the imaging equipment." The young assistant hurried over with their scanner as Hannah continued clearing the area. What they uncovered defied explanation. Beneath the crystal-like substance lay what appeared to be a humanoid figure, female in form, with skin the color of pale jade. But most shocking were the 3 metal objects protruding from the figure's chest, unmistakably swords, their ornate hilts catching the dying sunlight. "Is it a burial?" June asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think so," Hannah replied, adjusting the scanner. "Look at these readings. No decomposition. If these are correct, this site is over 2,000 years old, but this body shows no signs of decay." Their alien guide, Tayo, approached cautiously. He belonged to the Rashi people, the nearest sentient species who had granted humans permission to study the ruins. His tall, slender frame bent as he peered at their discovery. "You should not disturb this place," he said, his universal translator giving his words a flat quality that didn't match the alarm in his 4 eyes. "This is from the dark time, before histories." Hannah looked up. "You know what this is?" Tahoe stepped back. "Only stories. Bad stories. We do not speak of the sleeping ones." "Please, any information could help our research," Hannah pressed. The alien's breathing flaps fluttered, a sign of distress. "The old ones say they were judges, or perhaps weapons. They brought peace through fear. Then they were bound when they became too powerful." Hannah turned back to the figure. Despite the 3 swords piercing its chest, the face appeared serene, almost as if sleeping. "We should report this to base camp," Jun suggested. "Professor Song will want to see this immediately." "Yes," Hannah agreed reluctantly. "Cover it for now. We'll do a full documentation tomorrow." As they placed protective sheets over the discovery, Hannah's hand accidentally brushed against the hilt of the smallest sword. A jolt of energy, like static electricity but warmer, traveled up her arm. She gasped and pulled back. "Are you okay?" June asked. "Fine," she said, "just static." But as they walked back to camp, Hannah couldn't forget the sensation. It hadn't felt random or accidental. It had felt like recognition. That night, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the buried figure with its 3 swords. The entire research team had been excited by her discovery, but Professor Song had ordered minimal intervention until proper authorities could be consulted. "This could be the most significant find in xenorchaeology," the professor had said. "We must proceed with extreme caution." Around midnight, Hannah gave up on sleep. She pulled on her jacket and stepped outside her tent. The planet's 3 moons illuminated the landscape, turning the dig site into a silver-bathed tableau. Without consciously deciding to, she found herself walking back toward the discovery. The protective coverings fluttered slightly in the night breeze. Hannah stood looking down at the shrouded figure, then carefully removed the coverings. In the moonlight, The crystalline encasements seemed to glow from within. The three sword hilts cast strange shadows. "What are you?" Hannah whispered, kneeling beside the figure. She reached out, hovering her hand over the smallest sword, the one she had touched earlier. Something pulled at her, not physically but mentally, like a voice calling without sound. Warnings echoed in her mind. Tahoe's fear, Professor Song's caution, but they seemed distant compared to the immediate need she felt. Her fingers closed around the hilt. It was warm, vibrating slightly as if alive. Without fully understanding why, Hannah knew what she needed to do. She gripped the sword firmly and pulled. The blade slid free with surprising ease. Bluish light erupted from the wound, bathing the excavation site in ethereal illumination. The crystal encasement cracked, lines spreading outward like a spiderweb. Hannah fell backward, still clutching the sword. It felt lighter than it should, perfectly balanced in her hand. The light from the figure grew brighter, forcing her to shield her eyes. When she looked again, the figure's eyes were open. They were not human eyes. They contained no whites or pupils, just pools of swirling silver light, ancient and knowing. The figure's chest rose and fell with a first breath taken after centuries. "You," the figure said, her voice sounding like multiple voices layered together. "Human, you have awakened me." Hannah couldn't speak, couldn't move. The sword in her hand hummed with power. "Two bonds remain," the figure said, her gaze falling to the two swords still embedded in her chest. "But the first key has turned," her silvery eyes fixed on Hannah again. "Do you understand what you have begun?" Hannah shook her head, finding her voice at last. "Who are you?" The figure's mouth curved into something like a smile. "I am Nera, last guardian of the Stellar Council. And you, human, have just changed the fate of galaxies." In the distance, alarms began to sound from the base camp. Lights appeared as people emerged from tents, drawn by the blue glow still emanating from the excavation site. "They are coming," Nera said, struggling to sit up despite the sword still piercing her body. "The Triad will sense my awakening. You must decide now, human. Will you finish what you have started, or will you run?" Hannah looked down at the sword in her hand, then back at Nera's ancient eyes. Whatever choice she made next, she knew her life would never be the same. Alarms blared across the research camp as Hannah stood frozen, the sword still humming with power in her hand. The figure, Nera, struggled to rise despite the two remaining swords in her chest. Her jade skin glowed faintly in the darkness, illuminating the fractured crystal that had imprisoned her. "You must help me stand," Nera said, reaching out with a slender hand. Hesitating only briefly, Hannah grasped it. The contact sent waves of images flooding through her mind. Stars being born and dying, civilizations rising and falling, and a council of beings like Nera passing judgment on warring worlds. What was that? Hannah gasped, nearly dropping the sword. Memory echo. The bond forms. Nera winced as she moved, the remaining swords shifting painfully in her chest. "There is no time to explain fully. Your people are coming, and they will not understand." The research team was indeed approaching, led by Professor Song. His face showed shock as he saw Hannah standing with the sword, the alien figure now awake and moving. "Dr. Kim, step away immediately," he shouted, his voice carrying across the excavation site. Tahoe, their Rashi guide, pushed through the crowd. When he saw Nara, he fell to his knees, his four eyes wide with terror. "Guardian," he whispered in his own language, the translator struggling to keep up. The legends were true. "Hannah, what have you done?" Professor Song demanded as he reached them. Before she could answer, a high-pitched whine filled the air. Everyone looked up to see three streaks of light cutting across the night sky, heading directly toward them. "The Triad sensors have detected me," Nara said grimly. "They come to ensure I remain bound." "What is she talking about?" Professor Song asked, looking between Hannah and the alien. Hannah found herself answering with knowledge she shouldn't possess. "The three," the Mavic, the Solari, and the Vosh. They imprisoned her thousands of years ago. How do you know this? Professor Song's face showed alarm and confusion. Hannah looked down at the sword, then at her hand clasped with Nara's. I think we're connected somehow. Nara's silver eyes fixed on the approaching lights. Human, you have freed one bond. The sword you hold was the blade of thought, imprisoning my mind. I am still physically weakened by the blade of body and spiritually constrained by the blade of soul. The lights in the sky grew larger, resolving into spacecraft unlike anything in the human fleet. They were angular, predatory in design. We need to leave. Now. Hannah felt certainty cutting through her confusion. This is absurd, Professor Song objected. We need to contact Earth Command and follow first contact protocols for. A beam of energy sliced through the air, striking the ground 50 meters from the excavation site. Earth erupted skyward, the shock wave knocking several researchers off their feet. That was a warning, Nara said, struggling to stand straighter. The next will not be. Chaos erupted in the camp as researchers scattered, grabbing equipment and running for the shuttles. Professor Song shouted orders, trying to maintain some semblance of organization in the evacuation. Hannah turned to Nara. Can you walk? With difficulty. These remaining bonds weaken me. She gestured to the swords. Why do you help me, human? I don't know, Hannah admitted, but something tells me I should. They moved awkwardly toward the nearest shuttle, Nara leaning heavily on Hannah. The sword Hannah carried seemed to pulse in time with her rapid heartbeat. Behind them, more energy beams struck the camp, setting equipment ablaze. June appeared at Hannah's side. The main shuttle is prepping for emergency evacuation. Professor Song sent me to find you. His eyes widened as he took in Nara more fully. It's she. Is this actually happening? No time to explain, Hannah said. Help me get her to the shuttle. June hesitated only a moment before moving to Nara's other side. Together, they half-carried her through the chaos of the burning camp. They reached the shuttle as its engines were warming up. Professor Song stood at the entry ramp, waving researchers aboard. You can't bring that being with us, he said when he saw them approaching. She comes, or I stay, Hannah replied, surprising herself with her own certainty. Another energy blast hit nearby, rocking the shuttle. Professor Song's face hardened, but he stepped aside. Hurry up, then. Once inside, they secured Nara to a seat. The remaining researchers stared openly at the alien with swords protruding from her chest. The shuttle lifted off shakily, its pilot pushing the engines hard to escape the planet's atmosphere. 3 ships pursuing, the pilot announced tensely. They're faster than anything I've ever seen. Nara's breathing was labored, the movement of the shuttle clearly causing her pain as the swords shifted in her chest. They will not let us escape easily. The Triad has feared my kind for millennia. What exactly are you? Professor Song demanded, standing over them. I am the last guardian of the Stellar Council, Nara replied. We were created to maintain balance among the spacefaring races, to prevent wars that could destroy entire systems. Created by whom? The professor pressed. Those who came before, the architects. Hannah felt another wave of images flood her mind, massive beings manipulating the very fabric of stars, creating the guardians as living tools of justice. The Triad feared our judgment, Nara continued. The Mavic, the Solari, and the Vosh had committed atrocities against younger races. They conspired to imprison us one by one. I was the last. The shuttle rocked violently as something struck its shields. We can't outrun them, the pilot called back. Shields at 60%. Nara's silver eyes fixed on Hannah. The sword you pulled, the blade of thought, it responds to you. This is unexpected. Humans were unknown to us when I was imprisoned. What does that mean? Hannah asked, gripping the sword tighter. It means you might wield it. Only certain beings can channel guardian weapons safely. Another hit rocked the shuttle. Shields at 40%. The pilot shouted. We can't take much more. Nara grabbed Hannah's wrist with surprising strength. Listen carefully. The blade responds to will and intent. Focus your thought through it. I don't understand, Hannah said desperately. Imagine a shield around this vessel. Pour your will into the blade. Feeling ridiculous but seeing no alternative, Hannah closed her eyes. She pictured a protective bubble surrounding the shuttle, blocking the attacks from the pursuing ships. The sword grew warm in her hand, then hot, almost painful to hold. Something's happening, the pilot exclaimed. Their weapons, they're being deflected. Hannah opened her eyes to see the sword glowing with the same silvery light as Nara's eyes. She felt drained, as if she'd run a marathon. Impossible, Professor Song whispered, staring at the sword. No, Nara said, a hint of a smile on her pale face. Prophesied. The legend said only the unmarked could break the bonds, those who knew nothing of the ancient wars. She looked at Hannah with something like wonder. Humans were unknown to us. You were not part of our conflicts. That is why you could pull the sword when no other beings could. The shuttle lurched as the pilot executed a desperate maneuver. I'm setting course for the jump point, but they're still on us. Nara's expression grew solemn. The bond between us grows stronger, human. Soon, you will understand what has begun. But know this, you have not merely freed one captive. You have reignited a war that has smoldered for thousands of years. Hannah looked down at the glowing sword in her hand, then at the alien with 2 more swords buried in her chest, and wondered what she had started. The shuttle shuddered as it pushed through the upper atmosphere, alarms blaring throughout the cabin. Hannah gripped her seat with one hand and the sword with the other as the vessel bucked violently. Jump engines charging. The pilot shouted over the noise. 60 seconds to jump capability. Professor Song moved unsteadily through the cabin toward Hannah and Nara. His face was tight with anger and fear. You've endangered this entire expedition, Dr. Kim. When we reach the outpost, I'll have no choice but to report this incident. Nara's silver eyes fixed on him. Your outpost will not be safe. The Triad will follow us there. 3 ships still in pursuit, the pilot called out. They're gaining. Another blast struck the shuttle, sending a shower of sparks from an overhead panel. Several researchers cried out in alarm. 30 seconds to jump. Hannah felt something through the sword, a distant awareness of the pursuing ships, of the beings within them, filled with ancient hatred and fear. They're charging weapons again, she said without knowing how she knew. Evasive maneuvers, Professor Song ordered. The shuttle banked sharply, but not sharply enough. The next hit was direct. The lights flickered and emergency systems activated. A researcher was thrown from his seat, landing hard against the wall. Jump engines damage, the pilot reported, voice strained. I can't make the jump. June moved to Hannah's side. What do we do now? Nara struggled to sit upright, the movement causing fresh pain from the 2 embedded swords. There is a nearby system, Ceres. It has trading outposts not aligned with the Triad. If we can reach it. How do you know about current systems? Professor Song demanded. You've been imprisoned for thousands of years. I see through her, Nara said, nodding toward Hannah. Our minds touch. Hannah felt it too, an awareness of Nara's thoughts brushing against her own like fingers through water. I'm setting course for Ceres, the pilot announced after receiving a reluctant nod from Professor Song. But with damaged engines, we can't outrun them for long. The shuttle changed direction, pushing its straining engines to their limit. The 3 pursuing ships adjusted their course to match. They're spreading out, Hannah said, again speaking knowledge she shouldn't possess. Trying to box us in. Your connection grows stronger, Nara observed. The sword recognizes you as worthy. June leaned closer. Can you use the sword again, like you did before? Hannah tightened her grip on the hilt. I'll try. She closed her eyes, focusing on the pursuing ships. The sword warmed in her hand, but instead of the shield she had created before, she felt something different, a pulling sensation, as if the sword wanted to strike. Her eyes snapped open. I can't. It wants to attack, not defend. I don't know how to control it. The blade of thought responds to intention, Nara explained. Your fear shapes its power. A new alarm sounded from the cockpit. They're locking weapons on us, the pilot shouted. Hannah made a decision. Get me to the airlock. What? Professor Song and June exclaimed simultaneously. Trust me, she said, though she hardly trusted herself. With June's help, she guided Nara toward the rear of the shuttle, where a small airlock served as an emergency exit. The alien moved with difficulty, each step causing the remaining swords to shift painfully. What are you planning? June asked as they reached the airlock. I need space between me and the shuttle, Hannah explained, heart racing. I think I can distract them, maybe buy us enough time to reach Ceres. That's suicide, Professor Song said, having followed them. I forbid it. Hannah felt Nara's mind touching hers again. She will not be alone, the alien said. The sword will protect her. At least take an emergency suit, June insisted, pulling one from a nearby locker. Hannah quickly donned the suit over her clothes, the sword still clutched in her hand. It somehow passed through the material of the glove as if it wasn't there. 60 seconds to weapons lock. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. We can't evade all three. Open the airlock, Hannah ordered. Professor Song moved to block her. This is madness. This is our only chance, she responded. Then, more softly, June, make sure everyone gets to safety. June's eyes showed fear, but also understanding. I will. He pulled Professor Song aside and activated the airlock controls. As the outer door opened, Hannah felt the vacuum pulling at her. She stepped into the small chamber with Nara, the airlock door closing behind them. Are you ready? Nara asked, her voice somehow clear despite the vacuum surrounding them once the outer door fully opened. Hannah nodded, realizing with surprise that she could breathe normally despite being in space. The sword's protection, she realized. They pushed off from the shuttle, floating into the void. The three pursuing ships were visible now, sleek, predatory vessels, glowing with weapons energy. Now, Nara instructed, focus on the sword. Feel its purpose. Hannah raised the blade, which glowed brighter in the darkness of space. She felt its hunger, its desire to strike. This time, instead of fighting it, she surrendered to it. Light erupted from the blade, shooting toward the nearest enemy ship. It struck the vessel's weapons array, causing a small explosion that made the ship veer off course. They see us now, Nara said. The hunters become the hunted. Two of the ships broke off their pursuit of the shuttle, turning toward Hannah and Nara instead. The third continued after the human vessel. Your friends will have a chance now, Nara told her. But we must survive as well. Hannah felt strangely calm floating in space, the sword humming with power in her hand. What do? We run. Nara's hand closed over Hannah's on the sword hilt. Together. Energy surged through the blade again, but instead of attacking, it propelled them through space at impossible speed. Stars blurred around them as they moved faster than any human had traveled without a ship. Behind them, the two Triad vessels fired, but their weapons found only empty space where Hannah and Nara had been moments before. They traveled for what seemed like hours but might have been minutes. Time lost meaning in their headlong flight through the void. Finally, they began to slow as a planet came into view. A dusty, rust-colored world with scattered lights on its surface. Ceres, Nara said. The outpost is on the night side. They descended through the atmosphere, the sword protecting them from the heat of entry. As they approached the surface, Hannah saw a sprawling settlement of mismatched buildings and spacecraft. A trading post on the edge of charted space. They landed in an empty area at the outskirts, the sword's energy finally dimming as their feet touched the ground. Hannah fell to her knees, exhausted from channeling the blade's power. We must find shelter quickly, Nara said, supporting herself against a nearby structure. The Triad will send ground forces when they cannot find us in orbit. Hannah looked up at the alien who had changed her life in the span of a single day. Why me? Why did the sword choose me? Nara's silver eyes softened. Perhaps it was not the sword that chose, but something greater. The universe has patterns we cannot always see. She looked toward the settlement, where beings of various species moved about their business, unaware of the fugitives who had just arrived or the ancient conflict that had followed them. Come, Nara said, offering Hannah her hand. Our journey has only begun. The trading outpost of Ceres hummed with activity even in the planet's early hours. Hannah followed Nara through narrow streets, both of them drawing curious glances from the diverse array of alien species. The sword, now dormant, hung at Hannah's side, somehow attached without a scabbard or belt. We need to find somewhere to rest, Hannah said, her body aching from their escape, and figure out our next move. Nara nodded, her movements still pained by the two swords protruding from her chest. There is a place ahead. I can sense it. How do you know this place at all? Hannah asked. You were imprisoned for centuries. I see fragments of knowledge through our bond. Nara explained. Your memories, experiences of your kind in this sector. They turned down a side street lined with establishments catering to spacers and traders. Music and voices spilled from open doorways. Nara suddenly stopped before a building with a faded sign bearing symbols Hannah couldn't read. Here, Nara said. This place will serve. Inside was a dimly lit tavern. Various species sat at scattered tables, drinking, eating, or engaged in games of chance. Conversations quieted as they entered, many eyes turning to stare at the strange pair, especially at Nara with her jade skin and the swords embedded in her chest. An older human man approached them, wiping his hands on a cloth. His weathered face showed surprise but not fear. Interesting guests tonight, he said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Hannah couldn't place. I'm Chunho, owner of this establishment. We need shelter, Hannah said simply. And information. Chunho's eyes moved from Hannah to Nara, then to the sword at Hannah's side. Something like recognition flickered across his face. Follow me, he said after a moment's consideration. Not often we get a guardian and her bonded in these parts. Hannah exchanged a surprised glance with Nara as they followed Chunho to a back room. It was small but clean, with a table and chairs and a sleeping platform. How do you know what she is? Hannah asked once the door closed behind them. Chunho smiled slightly. My grandmother was a lorekeeper. Told stories of the guardians when I was a child. Never thought they were more than legends until now. He looked at Nara with something approaching reverence. The 3 blades of binding. I see 2 remain. Your knowledge is unexpected, Nara said, easing herself into a chair. And welcome. The Triad has agents on Ceres, Chunho warned. You won't be safe here for long. We need to reach the Temple of Stars, Nara said. It is the only place where the remaining swords can be removed. Chunho's eyebrows rose. That's deep in Solari territory now. One of the Triad races. We have no choice, Nara replied. The binding can only be broken at specific locations. The temple is the nearest. A knock at the door interrupted them. Chunho opened it cautiously to reveal a slender alien with copper-colored skin and 4 arms. Suma, Chunho greeted the newcomer. Perfect timing. Sumi entered, her large eyes widening at the sight of Nara. She immediately bowed deeply. Guardian, she whispered in a musical voice. The patterns speak true. Sumi is Vosh, Chunho explained, noticing Hannah's confusion. Vosh. Hannah tensed. Part of the Triad that imprisoned you, she said to Nara. Not all Vosh supported the binding, Sumi said quickly. My lineage has waited generations for this day. The reclamation. What's she talking about? Hannah asked Nara. Before Nara could answer, another knock came at the door. This time, when Chunho opened it, 2 more aliens entered, one with scaled skin and vestigial wings. the other tall and crystalline in appearance. "A guardian lives," the scaled one said, voice raspy with emotion. "I am Dohyun of the Mavic Resistance." Kuhu of the Solari Truth Seekers, the crystalline being introduced himself. Hana looked around in bewilderment. "What is this?" "The beginning of something long prophesied," Nara said, her silver eyes bright with unexpected hope. "Representatives of the three races that imprison my kind. Yet these ones come as allies. Not all of us supported the actions of our ancestors," Dohyun explained. "Some of us have kept the old knowledge alive, waiting for the day a guardian would return." The prophecy spoke of an outsider who would draw the first sword, Kuhu added, his crystal body chiming softly as he moved. "A species unknown during the ancient wars." Humans, Hana realized. We weren't even spacefaring when Nara was imprisoned. Chunho nodded. "That's why it had to be you. No biases, no ancient hatreds. The Triad governments will hunt you," Chunho warned. "They have already sent messages throughout the sector offering rewards for the capture of the escaped criminal and her human accomplice." "We need to keep moving then," Hana said. "Not yet," Nara countered, placing a hand on Hana's arm. "You must learn to properly wield the blade of thought first. It is not merely a weapon, but an extension of will." Chunho cleared his throat. "I have a training room below, shielded from sensors." For the next several days, Hana trained with the sword under Nara's guidance, while their unlikely allies gathered supplies and information. The blade responded more readily to her commands now, extending or retracting its energy at her will. "The bond grows stronger," Nara observed after a particularly intense session. "Your human physiology has unique properties we didn't anticipate." "Is that good?" Hana asked, wiping sweat from her face. "It is interesting," Nara replied. "Humans seem especially suited to channel guardian weapons without the usual side effects." During rest periods, Hana learned more about their new allies. Each represented underground movements within their respective species that had preserved the truth about the Guardians, that they had been peacekeepers, not tyrants as official Triad histories claimed. "The Triad fears the return of true balance to the galaxy," Dohyun explained one evening as they shared a meal. "They have built empires on exploitation of younger races." "Like humans?" Hana asked. Kuhu's crystalline form shimmered with what might have been discomfort. "Your species was fortunate. You developed in a sector the Triad considered unprofitable. Had you been discovered earlier?" On the 7th day, their planning session was interrupted by Junho bursting into the room. "Triad enforcers just docked," he said urgently. "A full squad from each species. They're doing building-by-building searches." "We need to leave now," Chumi said, her four hands moving quickly to gather their equipment. "I have a ship," Dohyun offered. "Small but fast. It can get us to the edge of Solari space. And I can guide us through Solari territory to the temple," Kuhu added. Hana looked at Nara, who nodded. "It is time." They moved quickly through a hidden passage beneath Junho's establishment, emerging near the docking bays. Dohyun's ship was indeed small, barely large enough for their group. "Thank you," Hana said to Junho as they prepared to board. "For everything." The older man smiled. "My grandmother would be proud to see this day. The beginning of the reclamation." "What exactly is the reclamation?" Hana asked Nara as they settled into the cramped vessel. Nara's silver eyes met hers with an intensity that made Hana shiver. The return of balance to the galaxy, and perhaps much more. As Dohyun powered up the engines, Hana looked down at the sword at her side. It pulsed faintly, as if eager for what lay ahead. She thought of Earth, of her research team, of her old life that seemed impossibly distant now. "Are you ready?" Nara asked quietly. Hana nodded, surprised to find she meant it. "Ready." The ship lifted off, cutting through Saris's atmosphere toward the stars beyond, and the temple where the remaining two swords waited to be drawn. The Temple of Stars appeared first as a glimmer against the backdrop of space, a massive structure orbiting a dying red giant star. Do-Hyun's small ship approached cautiously, its systems running silent to avoid detection. "We made it," Shumi whispered, her four hands moving in a pattern of reverence. The sacred site. Hannah stared at the ancient structure through the viewscreen. It resembled a massive crystal flower, its petals extending outward for kilometers. Light from the dying star reflected off its surfaces, creating rainbow patterns across the void. "The Guardians built this?" she asked Nara. "No," Nara replied, her silver eyes reflecting the temple's light. "This predates even my kind. The architects created it as a nexus point where dimensional barriers thin. Their ship docked at a small, hidden port on the temple's outer ring. Knowledge provided by Kuwu, whose crystalline ancestors had once been caretakers of the site before the Triad took control. Triad patrols scanned this area every 6 hours. Kuwu informed them as they disembarked. "We have 4 hours remaining before the next sweep." The interior of the temple took Hannah's breath away. Vast corridors stretched before them, their walls inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. The ceiling arched hundreds of meters overhead, revealing the red giant star through transparent sections. "This way," Nara said, moving with purpose despite the 2 swords still embedded in her chest. "The chamber of binding lies at the temple's heart." They moved quickly through the corridors, encountering no other beings. The temple felt alive somehow, vibrating subtly beneath their feet. Hannah felt the sword at her side growing warmer with each step. "The temple recognizes the Guardian's presence," Do-Hyun explained, noticing Hannah's questioning look. "It awakens after centuries of dormancy." After what seemed like hours, they reached a massive doorway inscribed with complex patterns. It stood open, as if waiting for them. "This is wrong," Nara said, stopping abruptly. "The chamber should be sealed." "It's a trap," Sumi hissed, her copper skin paling. Before they could retreat, lights flared around them. A dozen armed figures emerged from side corridors, 4 from each Triad species. Guardian, a Solari officer, stepped forward, his crystalline body glowing with internal light. "Your escape was anticipated. This sacred site is the only place you could remove the remaining bonds." Hannah's hand moved to the sword at her side. It hummed with energy, responding to her surge of adrenaline. "Commander Taejo," Hugh said, recognizing the officer, "this doesn't have to end in conflict. The truth about the Guardians has been hidden too long." "Traitors," Taejo spat, "collaborating with the enemy of all civilized species. Is that what your histories teach?" Nara asked, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "That we were enemies rather than protectors. You were tyrants," a Mavic officer hissed, "imposing your judgment upon sovereign worlds." "Enough talk," the Vosh commander ordered. "Secure them all." As the Triad forces moved forward, Hannah drew her sword. The blade of thought flared with silver light, stopping the advance momentarily. "Nara," Hannah said urgently, "get to the chamber. We'll hold them off." To her surprise, Do-Hyun, Suma, and Kiwoo moved to stand beside her, drawing their own weapons. "The reclamation begins here," Do-Hyun said, his scaled skin changing color with emotion. The Triad forces attacked. Weapons fire filled the corridor, forcing Hannah and the others to take cover behind ancient columns. Nara moved toward the chamber door, her weakened state making her progress slow. Hannah focused on the sword as Nara had taught her, channeling her will through it. A wave of energy erupted from the blade, knocking several attackers off their feet. She felt the drain immediately. Using the blade's power demanded something from her each time. "Hannah," Schumann called out in warning as a Solari soldier flanked their position. Hannah turned too late. The soldier fired, his weapon's energy blast heading straight for her. At the last moment, Kiwoo threw himself into the path of the shot. It struck his crystalline body, shattering part of his shoulder. "Go," he urged through pain. "The Guardian needs you." Fighting past her shock, Hannah broke from cover and ran toward the chamber where Nara had disappeared. Weapons fire followed her, but the sword created a shield of energy that deflected the blasts. Inside the chamber, she found Nera standing before a raised platform bathed in light from the dying star above. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in the same shifting symbols as the corridors. "It is time," Nera said as Hannah approached. "The alignment is perfect." "What do I need to do?" Hannah asked, breathing hard from the exertion and fear. "The remaining blades can only be removed by one who understands what they truly bind." Nera's silver eyes fixed on Hannah. "The blade of body binds my physical form. The blade of soul binds my true power." Outside, the sounds of battle continued. Their allies were buying them precious time. "How can I understand what they truly bind?" Hannah asked desperately. "Through our bond," Nera replied. "What you have already begun to see." Nera took Hannah's hands and placed them on the hilt of the second sword, the blade of body. The moment she touched it, visions flooded Hannah's mind. Nera moving between stars without a vessel, manipulating matter with thought alone, taking different forms as needed. "Your true nature," Hannah whispered in awe. She gripped the sword firmly and pulled. It resisted at first, then slid free with a flash of green light. Nera gasped, her body straightening as some of her strength returned. The chamber shook. The star visible through the ceiling flared brighter, as if responding to the blade's removal. "Quickly," Nera urged. "The final blade." Hannah placed her hands on the last sword, the blade of soul. This time, the visions nearly overwhelmed her. Nara and her kind serving as mediators between cosmic forces, maintaining balance not just between civilizations, but between dimensions, protecting reality itself from threats beyond comprehension. You weren't just peacekeepers, Hannah realized. You were guardians of existence itself. With this understanding, she pulled the final blade free. A wave of blue light erupted from Nera, filling the chamber and expanding outward through the temple. Hannah shielded her eyes, feeling the power washing over her like a physical force. When she could see again, Nera stood transformed. Her jade skin now shimmered with internal light, and she seemed taller, more substantial somehow. The wounds in her chest had healed, leaving only faint marks where the swords had been. "It is done," Nera said, her voice resonating with new power. "The Guardian returns." The chamber door burst open. The Triad commanders entered, weapons raised, but they froze at the sight of Nera in her true form. "Impossible," the Solari commander whispered. Behind them appeared their allies, battered but alive. Sumas supported Kuu, whose crystalline body was slowly repairing itself. "The reclamation," Do-Yun said, dropping to one knee. Nera looked at the Triad commanders with eyes that now contained galaxies. "Your ancestors feared judgment, but guardians do not exist to punish. We exist to protect." She gestured, and the weapons in their hands disintegrated into dust. "A greater threat approaches, the reason the architects created my kind. The void awakens at the edge of this galaxy, consuming stars and the life they support." Images appeared in the air around them. A darkness spreading across star systems, worlds going cold and lifeless in its wake. "This is why I was freed now," Nora continued. "The cycle returns, and new guardians must rise." Her gaze fell on Hannah, who still held the three swords. "Beginning with you, human. Your species has a role to play that was foreseen eons ago." Hannah looked down at the blades in her hands, feeling their power humming through her being. "What happens now?" Nera smiled, the first true smile Hannah had seen from her. "Now we prepare. The Triad will join us or fall. The reclamation is not just the return of the Guardians, but the restoration of purpose to all sentient beings." She turned to face the great window showing the dying star. "The darkness comes, but this time, we will be ready." Hannah stepped forward to stand beside Nera, the three swords glowing in her grasp, no longer tools of imprisonment but weapons of protection. Behind them, enemies and allies alike watched in silence as a new age began in the Temple of Stars.